The House of Shame, written and read by Christopher Halton. Salton Hall, a dilapidated 18th century clapboarded seafarer's house of 5 bedrooms, had stood alone, empty and unwanted for many years on the lower fringes of a Suffolk salt marsh. Once the proud home of a retired sea captain who died 20 years earlier, little local interest was shown in living in such a forlorn and remote location, which offered little shelter and respite from the salt-laden winds of the North Sea blowing in from beyond the crumbling seawall. The white-painted clapboard sheathing over old brick was worn and faded into grey, and the peeling painted sash windows were swollen with penetrating damp, cracking the small glass window panes, which were coated in dirt and dried salt. Its cobweb-covered rooms and dust-laden floors were but the residue of lingering memories, and the creaking of floorboards and doors were its voice. Relentlessly, the battering wind rapping against the windows with rain tapping the cracked glass created a haunting atmosphere. Lifeless eyes stare out in cautious fear of hidden secrets yet to be discovered from the gloomy depths within. Silently, thoughts of better days gone by drift into the tranquillity of abandonment, while the world beyond moves on unfettered from the past. Nestled next to a tidal creek, smugglers of old used the house to conceal their illicit contraband brought under cover of darkness to avoid the revenue men's unwanted intrusion by offshore boats armed with dry powdered cannon and muskets at the ready. In modern times, fishermen and wildfowlers claim that mysterious lights and muffled voices haunt the waters of the creek, accompanied by the sound of rowing boats gliding to the shore. And just occasionally this manifestation is preempted by a signalling lantern flash from within the old house before extinguishing back into darkness again. But that was the past, and in the present of 1926, the house struggled to find a buyer to breathe new life into its fading facade. That was until Giles Frobisher and his wife Amanda spotted the house from their offshore cruising cutter in June of that year, as they berthed overnight just offshore. Giles, the 30-year-old son of a wealthy merchant banker, Sir Archibald Frobisher, and Amanda, the 25-year-old daughter of an American oil baron, were both young and affluent enough to be able to take on any financial challenge. Observing the house out at sea through a pair of binoculars, they could see a for sale board fixed to the property, which immediately piqued their interest. Intrigued, they arranged for the 4-man crew to row them ashore, where the rowing boat was pulled up from the water onto a compacted stone slipway, where they set foot to wander around the property, taking note of its parlous condition. They rubbed the dried salt from the window panes and peered through the semi-opaque glass into the bare rooms within. Damp had penetrated the plastered walls, which were splashed with grey mould, and sections of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving the floor covered with chunks of plaster, which resembled discarded pieces of a wedding cake. It had a certain atmosphere, and not just of sadness, but of a circumspect presence that was all-seeing and all-knowing. It was plain to see that considerable renovation had to be done to make this derelict into a habitable home once more. However, considering its location and the safe anchorage available in the creek, which could easily accommodate their 40-foot cutter even at low tide, they decided to contact the solicitor to arrange a viewing. Having later returned to their home in Mayfair, London, they contacted Mr. Runcie of Smith, Arbour and Runcie's solicitors to attend and assess the property for purchase. Following a phone call to the practice in Aldborough, they arrived a week later at these offices, where they were welcomed by Mr. Runcie, the sole partner, in his well-appointed office. The office was well furnished and comfortable. Mr. Runcie, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, greeted them warmly and professionally. Mr. Runcie, a man of medium build, immaculately dressed in a black pinstripe morning coat, grey waistcoat, grey trousers, and a wing-collared shirt with a black tie, invited the couple to sit in a pair of wing leather chairs, whilst his secretary made a pot of tea with a small milk jug, saucered cups and sugar, which she presently brought in on a tray before the business in hand concerning the house took place between them. Having made them comfortable, Mr. Runcie began. The property has a great deal of potential, but as you have seen, and I make no bones about it, it does require a great deal of work. What is your interest in acquiring it, as I have some far better residencies I can offer you, which might be far more beneficial to your needs?" Giles chimed in. "Well, that house is top hole, as we are both a keen sailing couple, and the location being close to the sea with the deep water mooring nearby is absolutely spiffing. We appreciate that the amount of work needed is frightfully extensive, and last week I sent a surveyor to assess that aspect, so we realise it will be awfully costly." Mr. Runcie smiled in anticipation of a quick sale for a property he had never expected to sell, but he knew from inquiries with friends in London that the Frobishers could afford it. "I take it, therefore, that you both wish to carry out a viewing, and I am more than happy to loan you the house keys for a couple of days to ensure you are both fully aware of the internal state before completing any purchase." "Oh, absolutely, old chap," replied a visibly excited Giles, as he sipped tea from a Minton china cup with saucer. "We will drop the keys off later today, as we have to return to London tonight." Having ended their small talk, Mr. Runcie handed over a large bunch of old-fashioned keys, which were reminiscent of a jailer's than any modern house set, and he added, "Just drop them through the letterbox on the way back, and we can discuss the house later if you still wish to buy." "Jolly good show, Mr. Runcie," replied Giles in a peak of enthusiasm, and with that they got up, shook hands, and left. Within the hour the couple arrived at the house in their Bugatti sports car, and having parked on a trackway nearby, they made their way across some reeded marsh which swayed softly in a breeze, before arriving finally at the gravelled entrance, an imposing 18th century heavy oak-framed door with a shell cupola above, and a leaded semi-elliptical fan-shaped window beneath it. With some effort they partially prized open the door, and pushing hard against the stiffness of neglect, the door eventually swung open. Inside the hall they saw a series of doors on either side accessing the lounge, dining room, library and kitchen areas. Ahead was a wide-railed staircase. Broken arch pediments elegantly surmounted the internal door frames, and the panelled mahogany doors were fitted with high-quality brass knob handles with brass backplates. Both were intricately incised with scrolling patterns of flora and fauna, which added an air of classy informality to what otherwise was a run-down property with cracked ceilings, flaking paint, and thick layers of dust, which raked up a cloud of fine detritus when walking on it, and leaving in its wake heavy footmarks like footsteps in the snow. It was abundantly clear that no living human had set foot inside in many years. Amanda looked on in shock, mixed with excitement, and commented, "In so many ways this house is what I want, but the work that needs to be done is rather daunting." Dusting his hands, Giles replied, "Yes, my dear, jolly well daunting indeed, but like you I love the house." They explored the upstairs leading to the master bedroom, 3 guest rooms, and a staff room for servant accommodation, all in a parlous state, and of course there was no electricity, water or sewers, which had to be put in. As they were about to go downstairs, Amanda noticed from the landing window a woman walking past with a small child. Both appeared plainly dressed, but in the fleeting seconds she saw them, they had gone. Looking back at her husband, she said, "Giles, darling, we have visitors." Surprised, he replied, "Here? Who on earth could they be?" Curious, both walked down the stairs and went outside. There was nobody to be seen. "Are you sure about this, old bean?" he said as he shaded his eyes with his hand to scan the horizon from the blaring sun. Amanda agreed that she might have caught a glimpse of the bright light from the sun, and the figures could have been a reflection. They thought nothing more of it and continued to look around the house. There was something creepy in the atmosphere, but they attributed it to the house's current state and the damp, musty smell that pervaded its dank and dirty interior. Having completed this inspection, they went to the rear wall garden, which was overgrown and weed-filled, with buddleia bushes predominating in a competition with other shrubs for space. In the centre of this, and shaded from view by weed and shrub, was a lichen-covered stone stele of no more than 3 feet in height, which at first was assumed to be a grave. Giles pulled away the damp green shroud and discovered it was a memorial marker to the loss of the Prudence Usher, a brigantine passenger ship which broke up and sank offshore in February 1740 with the loss of 75 passengers and crew. How odd, Amanda, to place a memorial stone in the garden of this house, and I wonder where exactly this ship sank and whether there were any survivors. Both agreed to make this a focal point in the restored garden. After finishing their inspection, they locked the property and returned to Aldborough to deposit the keys through Mr. Runce's office letterbox. Over the next few weeks, after a price was agreed upon and the property had been purchased in July, the Frobishers engaged numerous artisans and engineers through an agent to complete a full restoration of the property, which was scheduled to be completed by the following February. Cash was obviously not an issue for the Frobishers, and they expected the finished property to be of the highest standard, which also included a team of road engineers to complete a new road from the house and onto the mainland. All very ambitious, but nothing whatsoever was a problem. The agent in charge and overseeing the entire project was an architectural engineer from London, namely Robert Smithson, who rented a small cottage in Aldborough during the restoration. He was an ex-army major in the Royal Engineers, and as such, he had good management and engineering skills to ensure the work was completed on time. On site, Smithson had access to a prefabricated wooden office that was insulated against the elements. Inside, he had a desk, fire stove, lighting and telephone installed, and from here he provided daily updates to the Frobishers, who were very pleased with the work's progress. Work progressed well during July and August, with essential services such as electricity, water and sewerage connected. In mid-September, as the nights were starting to draw in, 2 builders working alone in the master bedroom suddenly collected up their tools and fled the house. Hearing the commotion, Smithson confronted the men as they prepared to go off-site. Having a large, burly, no-nonsense persona, Smithson was a difficult man for the builders to ignore. Confronting the 2 men with the narrowing eyes of a controlled rage, he bellowed at 2 simpering and terrified workers, "Where on earth do you think you are going?" One, a local man named Daniel Jacobs, replied fearfully, "I ain't staying a moment longer here, sir. The place is haunted, I tells you, haunted by a ghost. You ask my mate Marcus. He'll tell you that too." Having calmed both men down, they told him what had happened. Earlier in the afternoon, Smithson had instructed the men to remove some rotten floorboards for replacement the following morning by carpenters. It was a routine task and should not have taken half an hour. As they prized open one piece with the leverage of a crowbar, they discovered a small metal box of some vintage hidden in place between the flooring joists. Once they removed a second section next to it, they were about to lift it out to examine it, when Jacob saw a shadow of a cloaked man in a tricorn hat move across his legs, and a voice said, "There be my property you have, and I warn you to leave well alone." Both men clearly heard the disembodied voice, and in abject terror, they grabbed their tools and fled. Smithson took the men back with him to the room and saw the metal box in situ inside a cavity next to a flooring joist. Lifting out the 6-inch long box, he noticed it was quite heavy with items rattling inside. Unfortunately, the box was locked and there was no key. Smithson, feeling the subject of some cruel joke played on him, turned on the terrified men. "You are paid good money to work here on this contract, and instead of carrying out a simple task, you make up this cock and bull story instead." Picking up a crowbar from Jacobs's bag, he threw it on the floor in front of the 2 bewildered men and snapped, "Now finish the job or I shall sack you both immediately." Under his supervision, the men completed the task and they went home. It appeared to be a small sturdy box handmade by a blacksmith and looked to date from the 18th century. It was undamaged and bore no sign of wear or rust, which quite surprised him. He was no expert, but he knew of a respected Aldborough antiques dealer who might be able to help. Having locked up the house and site for the night, he drove to the shop in question, where he was able to catch the owner, Michael Burgess, before closing. Burgess, whose thin, long face sported round-rimmed glasses which were crowned with a mass of grey, thinning, unkempt hair, had a scholarly, educated look about him and was quite knowledgeable with antiques and objets d'art. Complemented in dress by an oversized cardigan and black trousers, he exemplified an eccentric academic. Smithson presented the box to him, which immediately elicited a reaction of surprise and joy from Burgess's now excited face as he lifted it to the light and stared quietly and intently for a few minutes, observing in some detail every facet. As he placed the box on a table, he finally spoke. "This is a small travelling strongbox used for jewellery and important personal items. It is handmade and suggests a date between 1700 to 1800. It certainly has a good rattle, so there may be something of value within. Have you a key?" Smithson responded that he hadn't, and Burgess disappeared briefly to the back of the shop, from where he emerged with a box of old-fashioned skeleton keys. Selecting 20 that would fit the keyhole of the escutcheon plate, he played around with the keys before one eventually turned the lock and opened the box. The lid was very stiff, but after some effort and a little oil, it opened. By coincidence, the process was hampered when the lights flickered and the room felt briefly colder, but both men laughed it off as they continued excitedly to examine the contents of the box. They were surprised to see that it contained a large collection of gold rings of various descriptions, from wedding to signet. Some had diamonds or rubies, others were plain gold bands. Burgess examined them all for hallmarks through a monocular magnifying glass and said, "These date between 1690 and 1710, and the gold is 22 carat, which was the legal standard then. Collectively with the diamond and ruby settings, this is worth around £20,000. Would you mind if I asked where you acquired these?" Smithson, visibly shocked, sat down to regain composure, commenting, "This box was found hidden under the floorboards at Salton Hall by some workers." Burgess replied, "How strange they should all be rings of different sizes and obviously from many people. I have never seen that before, and the fact that they were hidden does raise some questions." Smithson agreed and thanked him, and then took the box and left to return to his cottage on the outskirts of the town. That night in his sleep, Smithson found himself back at Sultan Hall. This was a different time, and the house was in good repair, with staff busily working inside and outside the home. By their appearance and the interior furnishings, it looked to be around the mid-18th century. He wandered outside into the walled garden, which was immaculately laid to lawn, and they met a tall, slim man dressed in a black tricorn hat and a cloak. The man was in his late 30s and had a handsome, fine-featured face, with dark hair tied into a ponytail. Observing more closely, he wore a fine woolen dark frock coat with close-fitting knee breeches in matching cloth fastened at the knee with a buckle. The frock coat had a broad full front opening, and the snug fit showed off finely knitted silk stockings. To his side was attached a sword, and on his right hand was a large gold signet ring with the initials in a florid style depicting T.S. He walked over to him, removed his hat, bowed to Smithson, and casually introduced himself as Thomas Salton, the Squire of the Marshes and owner of the hall. "Good sir," he said, "I'm given to understand that you possess some mere trinkets I have collected. Could you be of good service and return them from whence you had removed them?" Smithson, despite knowing he was dreaming, felt strongly that he had been transported through time. He responded by telling Sultan that the items had been found abandoned and would be handed over to the hall's new owners at the first opportunity. Sultan became very angry as his face narrowed into a rage and quickly revealed a flintlock pistol from his belt, which he aimed and fired at him. Smithson felt a ball of lead rip into his body, and in an instant he was awake in his bed back in Oldborough, with a chest pain and a cold sweat that soon passed with no injury, save for a round red mark on his chest where he felt he was struck. It was then a chill down his spine made him realise that this experience was more than a dream. He also felt a pervasive atmosphere now in the cottage, and on one occasion was sure he spotted the fleeting shadow of Sultan. The next morning he drove to a safe depository at a nearby bank which held an account for the renovation project. Having received a receipt for the box left in their charge, he drove to the Aldborough Museum, which was housed in the beautiful 16th century Moot Hall building on the beachfront, whereupon he spoke to an elderly gentleman named Perkins, who was a volunteer archivist and historian. Mr. Perkins, an educated man in his late 70s, welcomed him into the timber-frame building and said, "How can I help you?" Smithson identified himself as the Salton Hall project manager and asked if he had heard of a Thomas Salton who was master of the hall. Mr. Perkins was surprised he had heard of Salton's name, replied, "Well, yes, I do know this chap fairly well. He was a dark character in his day, and was said to have acquired a great wealth through piracy, smuggling and plundering wrecks caught in storms off the coast. In fact, any criminal activity that kept him in wealth and good comfort." Smithson asked, "Did he build the hall as it seems to be in such a quiet and remote location?" Perkins pondered briefly and replied, "Yes, indeed, he did. I believe it was financed from the wreck of the Prudence Usher, a brigantine passenger ship which came ashore in a great storm in February 1740. In total, 75 lives were lost, and it was believed she was lured ashore by lights placed by him and his men to make them believe they were coming into Aldborough. Instead, they ran ashore." He paused and continued, "According to legend, not all drowned, and some made it safely to shore. Sultan and his men were believed to have murdered those survivors." He shook his frail head. "The tragedy is that there were many women passengers with children who were hoping to sail to America to start a new life, but Sultan ensured that none survived. After plundering the ship and the corpses, the wreck drifted out to sea and sank. Would the goods they had stolen have included jewellery from the victims?" Absolutely. From later accounts of villagers that attended the wreck, they reported that in some instances the bodies were naked, having had their clothing removed, although this was never confirmed. He paused. But sadly, none of this was ever proven against him, and some years later he simply disappeared and was never seen again. I believe a later owner of the hall erected a small commemorative monument to Prudence Usher in the grounds, which is still there today. During his time in the museum, as well as the earlier visit to the bank, Smithson felt an uncomfortable presence around him. That feeling of unease seemingly accompanied him back to Salton Hall, where he continued to supervise the work in progress. From then on, workmen complained of bad smells, unaccounted noises, strange shadows, and their tools disappearing and reappearing elsewhere in the building. But regardless, they soldiered on, and by January of the following year, a majority of the work was completed on schedule. It was then that Giles and Amanda came down to inspect the work and be the honoured first guests, as the master bedroom had not only been restored, but it was now carpeted and furnished to their tastes. With them was a retinue of staff from their Mayfair home, which included the cook, a maid, a valet, and the butler, who were similarly accommodated in the completed bedrooms. All were impressed with the almost renovated building. There were smaller issues to be completed, and the lounge was only half decorated. Still, regardless, it was habitable and, importantly, brightly lit with the electricity and with warm fires in every room. The couple congratulated Smithson, and he presented them with the safe box and rings to take back to London. They were aware of the backstory concerning the discovery, but obviously not of the strange matters which had seemingly happened in connection with them. Giles tipped the contents onto a table, both gasping in appreciation, whereupon Amanda selected a rather unusually heavy signet ring, which caused Giles to say, "No, it cannot be." "What?" responded a curious Amanda. "Look, darling, the ring is embossed with my family crest. How can that be?" It was then that he remembered vaguely a family story concerning a half-forgotten ancestor, Sir Rupert Frobisher, who died aboard a sailing ship which was sailing to America, where he had owned a plantation. I am finding this all rather weird to see this, and how the deuce it came to be hidden beneath." He stopped. "Oh my God!" he exclaimed. "The Prudence Usher! Do you remember the Stelly, darling, in the garden?" "Yes, Giles, it was sunk here in 1740, as I remember." Giles, now dizzy with shock, sat in an armchair, and Amanda poured a small brandy, which she brought to him. "Drink this, my dear. Yes, I am feeling as shocked as you." Giles drank the brandy and sat momentarily silent and frozen as the enormity of this discovery washed over him. Smithson, who was still on the premises, was summoned to the lounge by the butler, where he shared his knowledge of the discovery and his research, but he remained reticent about the ghostly experiences with both him and the workmen, as he did not wish to cause further unease. "So," said Giles, "this chap Thomas Salton, who built this house, may have done so on the proceeds of crime, and worse, the blood of my family. As I remember, Rupert was, I believe, transporting a chest of gold with him to be used in conjunction with the American estate, and this bounder probably plundered that too, and the lives of so many innocent people." Amanda interjected, "But regardless, he built this beautiful house, which, if you like, has been returned to us despite the misuse of your ancestors' gold." As they spoke, Smithson felt a terrible anger in the air, which to him was real and palpable, and he knew deep inside that Sultan had more tricks to play before the end of their stay. He therefore decided to share with them his sleep-related experiences of Sultan and the incident involving the workmen. Surprisingly, the Frobishers were quite unfazed, and dismissing the stories, stated that they had no intentions of leaving the hall, which they loved very much. During the night, the Frobishers were convinced that they had heard footsteps creeping around the bedroom in the dark, but upon turning on the light, the room remained silent. Having called out to the invisible walker to leave them alone, they returned to their slumbers without further incident, although they accepted that the house appeared haunted. The next day, the Frobishers left the hall early to spend the day walking across the vast expanse of marshland, while workmen were in the rear digging a deep trench to improve drainage issues at the house. At the same time, decorators worked busily in the interior to finish the house for the February completion. It was during the mid-morning that the labourers digging the trench reported that they had struck what seemed to be a stone slab buried a few feet down in the ground. Curious, Smithson ordered them to dig around the slab and expose whatever lay buried below. While they dug, he supervised them before being satisfied that they had exposed what appeared to be a stone sarcophagus. Bringing in extra men, the slab was carefully removed and placed to one side, where they saw inside what was the skeleton of a human being with the remains of rotted clothing. It was then that Smithson noticed that next to a hand lay a gold signet ring that bore in florid lettering the initials T.S. It was the one he had seen in his dream of his meeting with Thomas Salton, and he knew that his missing remains were his. To follow legal process, he informed the police of the burial, who attended in the early afternoon with a forensic expert in the form of Dr. J. A. Andrews, whose expertise determined that it was indeed an ancient burial and beyond the need of any police investigation, and that by examining some damaged vertebra, it appeared the owner in life may have been stabbed to death. By the time of Dr. Andrews' arrival, the Frobishers had returned and were shocked at the discovery. They, having consulted with the police and Dr. Andrews, the remains were removed and placed in a canvas bag, whereupon they were taken immediately to nearby St. Mark's Church, where the vicar, following a generous donation from the Frobishers, arranged in the early evening to have the remains interred after a short service in an unmarked grave on the north side of the church. And secretly buried with Sultan was the metal strongbox with the remainder of the jewellery, as they now in part believed Smithson's ghostly dream and decided they would feel better without these items. From that day forward, the Frobishers, and indeed Smithson, were not plagued by the odious presence of Thomas Salton, who had finally found his peace, and the house was completed without further incident in February, and as arranged they took up residence. Although some claim the churchyard is haunted by his presence today, this is merely a rumour, and no other sightings of Salton have been reported. Requiescat in pace. The end.